of Glasgow and Cambridge, and it was at the latter that he received his Ph.D. in 1968. He served on the faculty of the University of Nottingham from 1970 to 1982, then accepted a position at the University of Durham, where eventually he was appointed Lightfoot Professor of Divinity. He retired at the end of this past September, and now looks forward to spending more time than ever in research, writing, and family. Let me mention his books. I've selected the cream of the crop, the top 20. In 1970, Professor Dunn published Baptism in the Holy Spirit. In 1975, he published Jesus and the Spirit, a study of religious and charismatic experience. Jesus and the First Christians, as reflected in the New Testament. A revised edition came out in 1997. In 1977, he published Unity and Diversity, the New Testament, an inquiry into the character of earliest Christianity. In 1980, he published his classic Christology in the Making, a New Testament inquiry into the origins of the doctrine of the Incarnation. This is one of the books on the table. In 1985, he published The Evidence for Jesus. In 1987, he published with James Mackey, New Testament Theology in Dialogue, Christology and Ministry. In 1988, he published his 2-volume magisterial commentary on Romans in the Word Biblical Commentary series. In 1988, The Living Word. In 1990, Jesus, Paul, and the Law, Studies in Mark and Galatians. In 1992, Jesus' Call to Discipleship. He edited a volume, Jews and Christians, The Parting of the Ways, in 1992 and reprinted by Erdman's in 2001. In 1993, he published a commentary on Galatians. That same year, he published Christian Liberty, a New Testament perspective. That same year, he published The Justice of God, a fresh look at the old doctrine of justification by faith. That same year, he published The Theology of Paul's Letter to the Galatians. Then he took a breather for a couple of years, and in 1996 published the Acts of the Apostles. And that same year, the Epistles to the Colossians and to Philemon, a commentary on the Greek text. He edited a volume later that year, Paul and the Mosaic Law, and that volume is out on the table. And then one of these big door stoppers, 800-plus pages, in 1998, The Theology of Paul the Apostle. But not satisfied with that size, in 2003, he published a 1,000-plus page door stopper. In fact, it works well in propping up my window, I've noticed in my loft. Like Jesus Remembered. This book also is on the table in the foyer. Besides these numerous books, and I did not mention all of them, Professor Dunn has published hundreds of journal articles, book reviews, chapters, and other books and articles in various Bible and theology dictionaries and encyclopedias. Professor Dunn is a member of the Society of New Testament Studies, and he's a member of the Society of Biblical Literature, as well as other professional and scholarly organizations. He is past president of the Society of New Testament Studies. Professor Dunn has lectured in many universities and divinity colleges throughout Britain, Europe, North America, and other parts of the world. He has delivered several named and distinguished lectures, such as the Hinton Davies Lecture at Oxford University and the Ethel Wood Lecture at London University. And now Professor Dunn may claim the Hayward Lecture at Acadia. His lecture topic this year is Remembering Jesus. These lectures will constitute the second volume in the new series, Acadia Studies in Bible and Theology, published by Baker Academic. Acadia Divinity College is honored to include these lectures in this new series. Tonight's lecture is titled The First Faith. Please welcome Professor James Dunn.
That's yours. Thank you very much, Craig, indeed. It is a tremendous pleasure to be here, being a Scot. Nova Scotia has a particular attraction to us. We had never visited it until we visited it 2 years ago, and we spent a delightful fortnight, 1 week in Halifax and 1 week in Cape Breton, and we really enjoyed that. And the opportunity to come back so soon was one we could not pass up, particularly as the invitation came from Craig, our old friend. We hadn't managed to visit him when he was over on the West Coast, so this opportunity to visit him so soon in the East Coast was too good to pass up. So we're glad to be here and to experience a bit of Nova Scotia that we didn't manage to experience when we were here 2 years ago. I should perhaps just fill out a little of the introduction, because in the kind of mixed audience which you are, you might like to know how mixed I am, how mongrel my background is. As Craig mentioned, brought up in Scotland, trained for Presbyterian Church of Scotland ministry, went to England and went to the local church, which happened to be Methodist, and though we became Methodist, we're a bit like the Queen, you know. When we cross the border, we become something different. When she crosses the border, she goes from being an Anglican to being a Presbyterian. So we're, because of my early interests, I used to introduce myself as a Presbyterian Methodist with Baptist leanings and Pentecostal interests. And that really showed what a confused mess I was. And then somebody added to it by referring to me some time ago, I think I should say, in the Church Times, which is the Church of England main newspaper, as a promising young Anglican theologian. A friend said, well, at least they got the indefinite article right. Now, I hope you've all got handouts, because I'll be following the handouts, and normally I would like to, I usually lecture to handouts so that I can have good eye contact and all that, and get some kind of rapport with all you strange folks, just in case I don't speak the language quite as well as I should. But because these are to be published lectures and I've already written the material, and since the publications are to publish the lectures as given, I'm going to have to read the lectures so that what is published is what I actually said, rather than my wandering off the point as I work to a handout. So if you forgive me, I shall not have so much eye contact and rapport as I'd like. But let's see how it goes. So the first faith. And the subtitle is, When Did Faith Become a Factor in the Jesus Tradition? When did faith become a factor in the Jesus tradition? In my recently published Jesus Remembered, I attempt to engage with the long-running quest of the historical Jesus. I try to highlight what seem to me the key issues, historical, hermeneutical, theological, and the classic expositions of these issues. I note what also seem to me important advances made in the course of the quest, methodological insights which remain valid to this day. But above all, I hope that my own contribution will itself constitute some advance in the quest, at 3 points in particular. Elaboration of these 3 points will be the purpose and content of the 3 lectures which follow. In each case, it is my contention that the earlier quests have failed because they started from the wrong place, from the wrong assumptions, and viewed the relevant data from the wrong perspective. In each case, they forgot what should have been more obvious than it evidently was, and so lost the way almost from the beginning. First of all, they forgot the impact made by Jesus. The disciple-making, faith-creating impact of Jesus should be a fundamental given and an indispensable starting point for any quest for the Jesus from whom Christianity originated. It is this failure to appreciate and properly to evaluate the role of faith from the very first, which is the focus of my first line of criticism of the earlier quests. Not all questers, of course, are equally open to this criticism. It is the main thrust and consistent emphasis of the various quests with which I find fault. So, first of all, I'm a Methodist local preacher, so of course I always have 3 points, as you will see. So, first, the Christ of faith versus the historical Jesus. If the quest of the historical Jesus is characterized by one feature above all others, it is the contrast between the historical Jesus and the Christ of faith. Or probably more accurately, the antithesis between the historical Jesus and the Christ of faith. As is well known, the quest began by way of reaction against the Christ of Christian dogma. The Christ of the Chalcedonian Creed, perfect in Godhead and perfect in manhood, truly God and truly man, was just too unreal a human being. The Pantocrator, the world ruler of Eastern iconography, was too far removed from the man who walked the shores of the Sea of Galilee. How can we believe in such a Christ when, according to the letter to the Hebrews, he was able to sympathize with our weaknesses and who in every respect has been tempted as we are? It is the human Jesus, the one who truly knew and experienced the reality of everyday existence in first century Palestine, the Jesus who lived among the poor, who counted people like Martha and Mary as his close companions, who was known as a friend of tax collectors and sinners. That's the one we prefer to hear about. Is he not a more meaningful Saviour than the almost mechanistic God-man or the remote Pantocrator? No wonder the cult of Mary, the mother of Christ, became so popular when her son was so strange and heavenly. The heart yearning for comfort and an inspiring role model needed a mother figure to intercede with this awe-inspiring Christ, needed to rediscover the human Jesus behind the divine Christ. The contrast between the historical Jesus and the Christ of faith initially came to prominence in the title of David Friedrich Strauss's slashing critique of Friedrich Schleiermacher's Life of Jesus. Schleiermacher's lectures had been given in 1832 and were already seriously behind the times when they were published 32 years later. In them, Schleiermacher had concluded that the fourth gospel was written by John, the son of Zebedee, and therefore gave the most reliable and authoritative connected presentation of the life of Jesus. In the fourth gospel, Schleiermacher found a Jesus who was the historical actualization of his conceptualization of religion in terms of the feeling of absolute dependence. John's Gospel shows a Jesus who was distinguished from the rest of men by, quote, the constant potency of his God consciousness, which was a veritable existence of God in him. Or, quote again, his consciousness of God never failed him, and apart from it, he amounted to nothing. In response, Strauss's critique was cutting. His opening words are ones of denunciation. Schleiermacher's Christology is a last attempt to make the churchly Christ acceptable to the modern world. Schleiermacher's Christ is as little a real man as is the Christ of the church. The illusion that Jesus could have been a man in the full sense and still as a single person stand above the whole of humanity is the chain which still blocks the harbour of Christian theology against the open sea of rational science. And his concluding sentences are equally bleak. The ideal of the dogmatic Christ on the one hand and the historical Jesus of Nazareth on the other are separated forever. The great goal of the first phase of the quest of the historical Jesus, then, was to get behind the Christ of faith in order to recover the historical Jesus. The task was envisaged as though it was equivalent to restoring a great masterpiece. The layers of subsequent dogma were like the layers of varnish and dust, obscuring the authentic brushstrokes of a Michelangelo. Only by stripping the layers of dogma away could the original, authentic genius of Jesus himself be uncovered. So the war cry arose, back from the religion about Jesus to the religion of Jesus. Back from the gospel about Jesus to the gospel of Jesus himself. The task was to liberate the real Jesus, the historical Jesus, from the chains and obscurations of later faith. Not altogether surprisingly, given such a goal, two of the most famous products of the liberal quest of Jesus uncovered a Jesus who was indeed a far cry from the Christ of dogma. In Ernest Renan's romantic reconstruction, we find a Jesus who promoted, quote, a pure worship, a religion without priests and external observances, resting entirely on the feelings of the heart, on the imitation of God, on the direct relation of the conscience with the Heavenly Father. And in Adolf Harnack's even more influential version, we find a historical Jesus whose gospel centered on the fatherhood of God, the infinite value of the human soul, and the importance of love. For Harnack, true faith in Jesus is not a matter of creedal orthodoxy, but of doing as he did. By this time, it was already clear that to recover the historical Jesus was not simply a matter of stripping away the faith of creeds and later dogma. It was already the faith of the first Christians which had to be stripped away. For Harnack, it was Paul who had begun the process of transforming the simple Jewish moralizing message of Jesus into the Hellenizing religion of sacrificial cult. Jesus' gospel, focusing on the kingdom of God, was transformed by Paul into the gospel focused on Jesus himself. By that time, the end of the 19th century, Strauss's conclusion that in the fourth gospel, the Jesus of history had already been lost behind the Christ of faith had become the standard consensus. And William Breder simply completed the circle by insisting that the synoptic gospels too, not least the earliest of them, the Gospel of Mark, were also products of faith. The messianic secret of Mark, which holds the gospel together, had been contrived in the process of composing Mark's life of Jesus. Breder's conclusion proved to be of amazing influence and significance throughout the rest of the 20th century. In the words of Norman Perrin, the Vredestrasse had become the Hauptstrasse. The Vrede Road had become the highway. It ensured that the Gospels, every one of the four canonical Gospels, would be regarded as products of faith. It ensured that the starting point for study of any gospel passage would always be the assumption that the passage expressed the theology of that gospel's author. To argue that the passage may afford an insight into Jesus' own understanding of his mission could never be assumed in the same way. The burden of proof always would lie with those who wanted to find here words that Jesus spoke or actions which Jesus took. This influence was soon reinforced by the development of form criticism. Form criticism began as an attempt to penetrate behind the written sources of the Gospels to uncover the earlier forms taken by the Gospel. But the more influential aspect of form critical method was the thesis that each unit of tradition must have had a life setting, a Sitzumleben, which explains and determined that form. The corollary was directly in line with the outworking of Vrede's thesis. The unit of tradition reflects most directly the concerns and faith of its setting in life, its Sitzumleben Kirche, the life setting of the church. If the reader wants to argue that it also reflects a Sitzum Leben Jesu, that has to be argued for. However, it is the Sitzum Leben Kirche which can be taken for granted, and which may have created the unit, or at least have greatly modified the tradition to make it speak to that setting. Consequently, there can never be any assurance as to how much or how little may go back to the setting of Jesus' own mission. The Christ of faith continues to obscure the historical Jesus. Gunther Bornkamm, in pleading the case for a new quest of the historical Jesus in the 1950s, well indicates how inhibiting such assumptions were. Almost immediately in his life of Jesus, Jesus of Nazareth, he observes, "We possess no single word of Jesus and no single story of Jesus, no matter how incontestably genuine they may be, which do not embody at the same time the confession of the believing congregation, or at least are embedded therein." He continues, "In every layer, therefore, and in each individual part, the tradition is witness to the reality of his history and the reality of his resurrection. Our task then is to seek the history in the kerugma of the Gospels, and in this history to seek the kerugma." Nothing could be more mistaken than to trace the origin of the Gospels and the traditions collected therein to a historical interest apart from faith. Rather, these Gospels voice the confession, Jesus the Christ, the unity of the earthly Jesus and the Christ of faith. So the Christ of faith pervades the Gospels, and pervades them so thoroughly that the quest of the historical Jesus easily loses itself in the mist of post-Easter kerugma and faith, which seeps from every nook and cranny of the Gospel story. It is this total lack of confidence in our ability to penetrate fully through the layers of post-Easter faith which has undoubtedly been a major factor in persuading many scholars of the past and present generation to shift their attention away from historical questions regarding Jesus to reconstructing the context to which each gospel bears witness. Each gospel bears more immediate witness to the situation which gave it birth than to the originating impulse of Jesus' own mission. The debate about which traditions go back to Christ in, say, Mark's Gospel has become lost in confusion, and our hearing has been deafened by competing views. So let us focus rather on what Mark's Gospel tells us about Mark's community and its social and cultural setting. Or why torture our congregations with the grim news that we have so little confidence in our ability to hear and observe through the Gospels what Jesus himself did and said? More comfortable to bracket out questions of history and to focus on the closed world of the narrative itself, where discussion can be restricted within narrow and less threatening boundaries, and attention can be devoted to highlighting each evangelist's storytelling genius. The latest round in the epic contest, the historical Jesus versus the Christ of faith, appears in the work of the Jesus Seminar. Robert Funk, the doyen of the seminar, makes no secret of his desire to rescue Jesus from Christianity. For Funk, the continuing purpose of the quest of the historical Jesus is, quote, to set Jesus free from the scriptural prisons in which we have incarcerated him. The pale, anemic, iconic Jesus suffers by comparison with the stark reality of the genuine article. The logic for this rescue effort is along predictable lines. Whatever can be attributed to the communities which used this tradition is to be stripped away. Any use or echo of Scripture, any saying which is not aphoristic, parabolic, or a sharp retort, any hint of baptismal practice or of the circumstances of the early Christian mission, anything that smacks of common Israelite or Judean lore, or could have been said by any Christian sage, and particularly anything which is apocalyptic in character or hints at a Paul-like theology of the cross, or in a word, any sniff of faith. Not altogether surprisingly, the Jesus who emerges for Funk is, quote, a free spirit, a vagabond sage, the subverter of the everyday world around him. An historical reconstruction, apparently all the more convincing because it stands at such odds with the traditional picture of Jesus drawn from the Gospels. Funk's work, and that of the Jesus Seminar, is presumably intended to mark some kind of triumph of the historical Jesus over the Christ of faith. In all this, a striking feature is readily apparent, that in the quest of the historical Jesus, faith is a hindrance. Faith leads the researcher down the wrong road. Faith prevents the searcher from recognizing the real Jesus. Faith is bad. History is good. The Christ of faith is what we need to get behind. The perspective of faith obscures and deceives. We will only attain to the Jesus of history when all the elaborations and distortions of faith have been stripped away, and when all faith has been eliminated from the record and the resulting picture. What started as a protest against the artificialness of the creedal Christ, what began as an attempt to strip away the centuries-old layers of dogmatic and ecclesiastical contrivance, has ended up as a rejection of the Gospels themselves and their portrayal of Jesus, and a deep-seated suspicion of the Jesus tradition as a whole. It is all, from start to finish, the product of faith, and therefore to be discounted. It is this whole thrust which I find it necessary to question and challenge on two grounds. First, we must recognize that the first faith of the disciples is what makes it possible for us to gain any information about or insight into the Jesus of Galilee. And second, we must also recognize the fallacy of thinking that the real Jesus must be a non-faith Jesus, different from the Jesus of the Gospels. So my second point, the impact of Jesus. An inescapable starting point for any quest for Jesus should be the historical fact that Jesus made a lasting impact on his disciples. It can be regarded as one of the most secure of historical a prioris that Jesus made a deep impression during his mission. No one with any sense of history can dispute that Jesus existed and that he was active in some sort of mission in Galilee, probably in the late 20s or early 30s of the first century, prior to his execution in Jerusalem under Pontius Pilate. We know this because he left his mark on history. The historical fact of Christianity is impossible to explain without the historical fact of Jesus of Nazareth and of the impression he left. What he said and did evidently got home to many people, and it is the impact that he made in them which has resonated down through history. In particular, he made disciples. It is the effect that he had on them which in due course gave us the accounts of Jesus in the Gospels. The impact was not a slight one, a memorable epigram, a good story, or an exciting event which caught their attention for a day or two and then sank below the surface of their everyday consciousness. His mission changed lives. They became disciples. They gave up their jobs. They left their families. They committed themselves to him. They followed him. They were in his company day after day for many months. The impact of his mission turned their lives in a completely new direction. It lasted. The point I want to make here is that this response was already a faith commitment. They believed what he said. They responded to his challenge by joining his mission and trusting their lives to him. They believed in him. It is not necessary at this point to clarify what this faith consisted of or amounted to. The point is that the way they responded to Jesus can hardly be denied the description with words like faith, trust, commitment. Jesus may have created many different impressions on different people, impressions which we can no longer recover, but in the case of the disciples, the impact made by Jesus was a faith-creating impact. And it is from that initial disciple-making impact that all else follows. This is the first point to be noted then, that faith among the disciples of Jesus did not first arise with Easter. Of course, that earlier faith was illuminated and transformed by what happened on the first Good Friday and Easter day. Of course, as Bornkamm observed, it is Easter faith which provides the context for all the traditions about Jesus in their present gospel locations. The Gospels are clearly intended to preach the gospel. Surprise, surprise. Each of them clearly is designed to build up to the climax of the death and resurrection of Jesus. But the disciples of Jesus did not first become disciples at the cross or on Easter day. They were already believers in Jesus prior to that. The faith was no doubt inadequate in the light of its fuller version subsequently, but it was still faith. The second point follows. This initial faith shaped the Jesus tradition from the first. It would be possible to argue that the impact made by Jesus was on individual disciples who treasured the memory of what they had heard Jesus say and seen Jesus do, that they treasured that memory in their hearts and only after Easter began to talk about what they remembered. By so arguing, some could continue to insist that the faith which shaped the tradition from the first was Easter faith. It would be possible even to argue that the individual disciples continued to treasure their memories of Jesus in the secret of their hearts, and only when a Mark or a Matthew appeared, when they were old, did they begin to feed these memories into the newly developing tradition. That way, we could be sure that the Jesus tradition was first formulated from a perspective of well-developed Christian faith. But neither of these possibilities is even halfway plausible. It is scarcely imaginable that what Jesus said and did was not talked about. Gert Tyson's The Shadow of the Galilean gives a good and I think a fair impression of the way accounts and rumours of Jesus' teaching and action must have been widely circulated, readily available to even the only faintly interested. And if stories were being told about Jesus on a common interest basis, then it is highly probable that those favourably impressed by Jesus would have their own accounts of what it was that had impressed them, no doubt in part at least to explain their interest in Jesus to sceptical or inquiring neighbours. All the more so then should we expect those who had committed themselves to Jesus' cause to talk about Jesus' teaching and actions among themselves, not least to reassure themselves that their commitment to Jesus had not been a mistake. Such sharing of impressions, such reflecting on the striking things Jesus had said, such retelling stories of Jesus' doings are the obvious beginnings of the Jesus tradition. In this way, we may say, the initial forms of the Jesus tradition first took shape. The alternative of disciples staying silent all during Jesus' mission, with no talk of what had most impressed them, with no sayings of Jesus or memories of his healings to be shared when there was nothing else to do of an evening. The alternative of such hidden memories being suddenly jerked into verbal utterance by the event of Easter is simply too incredible even to be considered. Rather, it is a priori compelling to deduce that the Jesus tradition began as a matter of verbal formulation as the disciples talked together about the impact Jesus had made severally upon them. Another way of expressing the same point is that such repetition of Jesus' teaching, such formulation of stories about what Jesus did, about his encounters with others, was itself an expression of the commitment they were already making to the cause of Jesus. I need to put the point quite bluntly. The earliest forms of the Jesus tradition were the inevitable expression of their faith in Jesus, the converse of their commitment to become part of his disciple band. I repeat, the first forms of the Jesus tradition were indeed expressions of faith, of disciple faith, but not yet of Easter faith, not yet expressive of the gospel as it came to be expounded by Paul and the other first apostles, but born of, imbued with, expressive of faith nonetheless. Fortunately, this a priori deduction can be substantiated from the data of the Jesus tradition itself. In a very important but unduly neglected article, Heinz Schurman demonstrated by following form-critical principles that the beginnings of the sayings tradition in the Gospels must lie in the pre-Easter circle of disciples, and thus, as he added, with Jesus himself. The claim can be easily documented. Consider only the Sermon on the Mount, Matthew 5-7, or the parallel material in the Lucan Sermon on the Plain, Luke 6. The Beatitudes, the call to love the enemy and not retaliate, the demand to give to those who beg from you, the warning against judging others, about the speck in someone else's eye and the log in one's own, the tree known by its fruits, the parable of the wise man and the foolish man. Which of these has been created and determined by the gospel of Good Friday and Easter? Which evangelist in the Pauline mold would have been content to indicate that future prosperity depended on hearing and doing Jesus' words without any reference whatsoever to cross and resurrection? Much the more likely explanation is that such tradition was already treasured and formulated by the disciples before Easter. The form given to the tradition had become already firm and established, so that it was simply part of the pre-Easter Jesus tradition which the post-Easter churches took on board and continued to use. Of course, it was from then on recalled and used in a post-Easter context. But it was almost certainly already being used in that form in disciple gatherings before Easter. The faith which it expresses and which gave such tradition birth as tradition was the faith evoked by Jesus during his pre-Easter mission. Disciple faith, not yet Easter faith, not yet Christian faith, but faith in Jesus nonetheless. The importance of the point is well illustrated by the current discussion regarding the Q document, believed by most to be one of the sources drawn on, along with Mark, by Matthew and Luke. In the current phase of the quest of the historical Jesus, as much attention is now being paid to Q as was paid to Mark 100 years ago. Two features have been given especial prominence among those most active in Q research. One is the almost certain absence of a passion narrative from Q. Q consists almost exclusively of sayings of Jesus. The second is the Galilean character of the Q material. It appears to have been shaped in Galilee and to evince a Galilean perspective. Added to this is the now fairly standard assumption that a gospel reflects more clearly than anything else the community within which it originated or for which it was written. Hence we have talk of a Q community. In many discussions, this quickly becomes the assumption that Q somehow defines this community. The community holds to this document over against other communities who are similarly defined by their document, Mark's community in particular. Given such logic, the inference becomes fairly obvious. The Q community must be located in Galilee, and must have espoused an understanding of Jesus at odds with or even opposed to the gospel of cross and resurrection presented by Mark. On this reconstruction, the Q community, rather like the old 19th century liberals, believed in Jesus, the great teacher of wisdom, the one whose pungent aphorisms and sharp retorts continued to be a subversive force within Galilee in the 40s and 50s. The logic behind this reconstruction is fallacious at almost every point. I've commented elsewhere on some of these fallacies, including what I call the one document per community fallacy. Here I simply want to draw attention to the more obvious, much the more obvious explanation for the two features of Q which have been drawn into such speculation about the Q community: the absence of a passion narrative and the Galilean provenance of the Q material. The most obvious explanation for these features is that the Q material first emerged in Galilee and was given its lasting shape there prior to Jesus' death in Jerusalem. That is to say, it expresses the impact made by Jesus during his Galilean mission and before the shadow of the cross began to fall heavily upon either his mission or the memory of his teaching. The whole line of logic using Q to reconstruct the beliefs of a Q community illustrates a curious trait in 20th century investigation of the synoptic tradition. Here is tradition, Q, which purports to be tradition of Jesus' teaching and which was evidently shaped in Galilee. Yet rather than draw the obvious conclusion that this is the teaching of Jesus during his mission in Galilee, remembered and put into its present form by those who were with Jesus in Galilee, a quite different conclusion is drawn, that it reflects a post-Easter community of disciples who did not know about or were hostile to the message of Jesus' death and resurrection. Never mind that we know a good deal about Jesus' Galilean mission from non-Q tradition, and that the Q material is wholly consistent with that. Never mind that we know virtually nothing about churches in Galilee during the 40s and 50s. Never mind that the probability of Galileans not knowing or caring about what had happened to Jesus, his death in Jerusalem, must be almost zero. When scholarly argument continues to work with such assumptions about faith-corrupting tradition and about the priority of a form's sitz im Leben, without realizing that these assumptions should have been put in question long ago, no wonder its further logic demonstrates the negative proof of reductio ad absurdum. In Q, in short, we see the evidence of the a priori argument mounted earlier. Q demonstrates that Jesus' teachings had not simply been remembered by his first disciples, but had been put into forms which reflected the local and temporal provenance in which they were delivered and which endured in that form. The obvious deduction is that the teaching was put into these forms as an expression of the discipleship into which such teaching had called them. That is, to celebrate and share the mutual impact of that teaching and to make possible further reflection on that teaching as the mission of Jesus and their discipleship developed. In other words, the Q tradition reflects and bears testimony to the faith-creating impact of Jesus' ministry. It was formulated as an expression of faith indeed, but of the faith of the disciples which drew them into following him. As such, it takes us back not merely to the 70s or 80s when the Gospels were written, and not merely to the 40s, 50s or 60s when the Jesus tradition was being circulated around the first churches, but to the late 20s or early 30s, to the time and mission of Jesus himself. As such, it enables us to hear much more clearly than has regularly been assumed by Jesus researchers, to hear Jesus himself as he was heard by these first disciples. Which brings us nicely to my second main complaint about the historical quest for the historical Jesus. So my point 3, the so-called historical Jesus. A major problem with the quest of the historical Jesus is the very term, historical Jesus. It suffers from a split personality. On the one side, anyone who has attempted to define the meaning of the phrase is quite clear about it. The historical Jesus is the Jesus constructed by historical research. This is important. On a strict and proper definition, the historical Jesus is not the man who walked the tracks and hills of Galilee. The historical Jesus is what we know about that Jesus, what we can reconstruct of that Jesus by historical means. As Lee Keck put it, the historical Jesus is the historian's Jesus, not a Kantian Ding an sich, thing in itself. Despite that, however, on the other side, is the fact that the historical Jesus began life, as we may say, by being set in antithesis to the Christ of faith. The motivation behind the emergence of the phrase was a concern to cut through the thickets of dogma to discover the real Jesus behind them. Such motivation is not going to be satisfied if it is met instead with the thickets of historical uncertainty. What benefit is it to exchange the dogmatician's Jesus for the historian's Jesus? In other words, the phrase itself, whatever the niceties and qualifications of historical method, will not be satisfied to be anything less than a reference to the flesh and blood man, Jesus of Nazareth. And so we find, even among those who protest that they wish to stick with the first meaning, the Jesus reconstructed by historical research, that the historical Jesus is again and again being used for the man behind the Gospels, the real Jesus, the actual Jesus. However, such confusion only masked the real problem. The fallacy which subverted the quest of the historical Jesus from the first. This was the assumption that the historical Jesus must be different from the faith-inspiring Jesus. Characteristic of the quest is that it has been searching for a historical Jesus, not simply behind, but different from the Christ of faith. And different not simply from the Christ of faith, but in the end also different from the Jesus of the Gospels. Of course he must be different. It was the inhumanity of the Christ of faith which first motivated the quest. It was the suspicion that Jesus of Nazareth has been overlaid and hidden from us by postage of faith in Jesus Lord, which has continued to drive forward the quest. So, of course, a human Jesus, the historical Jesus, must be different from a Jesus seen through the coloured spectacles of belief that Christ was the divine Son of God. Let us, by all means, get back to the human Jesus, the historical Jesus. But the point already made undermines that whole project. For the point is that faith colours all the traditions we have about Jesus and has done so from the very first. Not Easter faith, as I've argued, but faith nonetheless. The earliest tradition bears witness in phrase and form to the impact made by Jesus. The formulation of that tradition was itself the expression of the trustful response which Jesus evoked from his disciples. The initial formulation of that tradition, we may say, was itself the impact made by Jesus. That which grasped and shaped their lives is what they put into verbal form in what we now call the Jesus tradition. And as we can tell the shape of the seal from the impression it makes on the page, so we can tell the shape of Jesus' mission from the indelible impression he left on the lives of his first disciples, as attested by the teaching and memories of Jesus, which they were already formulating during their initial discipleship. To quote Keck once more, the perception of Jesus that he catalyzed is part of who Jesus was. There are two important corollaries to this insight. One is that we can never succeed in stripping away that faith from the tradition, as though to leave a non-faith core. When we strip away faith, we strip away everything and leave nothing. We cannot press back through the tradition to a Jesus who did not make an impression or a Jesus who might have made a different impression. All we have is the impression he actually made. And all we can deduce from that is the character and teaching of the Jesus which produced that impression. This is precisely why I called my book Jesus Remembered, because we have access to none other than to Jesus as he was remembered. The historical Jesus, at best, can be none other than the Jesus who made the impact which is the beginning of the Jesus tradition. We can see Jesus of Nazareth only through the eyes and ears of these first disciples, only through the impressions embodied in the teaching and stories of Jesus, which they put into their enduring forms. The attempt to understand and perform historical research on the model of scientific research, or latterly on the model of archaeological research, has simply compounded the misunderstanding. The quest of the historical Jesus has been conducted as though it was like Madame Curie's quest for radium, a process of filtering out all other elements until the final precipitate, the long sought-for element itself, was exposed to view. Or like the archaeologist digging down through layers of historical strata in the hope of uncovering some artifact in the earliest stratum, which might explain why so much happened subsequently on that site. As though the historical Jesus was a hidden element, an archaeological artifact, a something, a ding and zich, which could be brought to sight and viewed wholly afresh, wholly independently of anything said about him then or thereafter. But that was never more than fanciful. The only Jesus available to us, I repeat, is Jesus as he was seen and heard by those who first formulated the traditions we have. The Jesus of faith. Jesus seen through the eyes and heard through the ears of the faith that he evoked by what he said and did. The other corollary is that we really do not have any other sources which provide an alternative view of Jesus, or which command the same respect as the Synoptic Gospels in providing testimony of the initial impact made by Jesus. We do not have an independent record of Caiaphas' view of Jesus, or of Pilate's judgment regarding Jesus. That is, no sources which attest a non-faith or a hostile response to Jesus. Would that we had. It would at least have enabled some triangulation between quite different references, different reference points. And other allusions to Jesus in non-disciple sources are too elusive to help much. It is true that several scholars, mainly associated with the Jesus Seminar, but others also, want to argue that some of the later Gospels, notably the Gospel of Thomas, provide evidence of a different faith response to Jesus. But while Thomas does indeed contain versions of Jesus' teaching, some of which are early in formulation, it is the synoptic tradition which provides the yardstick by which such judgments, early or late, can be made. And the modest enrichment of our knowledge of early tradition which Thomas offers, in the event, attests the same sort of impact made by Jesus as we find in particular in the Q tradition. Whereas the distinctive Thomas material, in almost every case, probably attests the influence of later faith, Gnostic faith. In that respect, we may say the Gospel of Thomas is a bit like the Gospel of John. They both attest the influence of later faith. In the one case, Gnostic faith, in the other, Christian faith. That is, both exemplify in their different ways the Christ of faith in protest against which the quest of the historical Jesus was first undertaken. Once again, then, we are confronted with the, to some, uncomfortable fact that the only Jesus we can hope to find in any quest is the Jesus of the Gospels. That is, the Jesus who made the impact which was the first phase of the Jesus tradition, but which also gave so much of the Jesus tradition the lasting form still preserved for us in the Synoptic Gospels. And is not this the Jesus we want to recover? The Jesus who made the impact thus embodied in the Gospels? The Jesus we are seeking is not some Jesus who might or might not have been significant, or who might or might not be more meaningful to 19th century liberalism, or to 20th century modernism, or to 21st century postmodernism. That Jesus is a will-o'-the-wisp, which draws questers unwittingly into the swampy ground of arguments of infinite regression. In contrast, the Jesus we want to find is the Jesus who was significant. The Jesus who made the impact he did make. The Jesus who was the fountainhead from which Christianity flowed. The Jesus who transformed fishermen and toll collectors into disciples and apostles. My point is simply that by recognizing the impact that Jesus made, as attested by the Jesus tradition, we can still hope to experience something of that impact today. Those of you familiar with the history of the quest will be well aware that I'm mounting an argument similar to that pressed home more than 100 years ago by Martin Kaler in his well-known essay, The So-Called Historical Jesus and the Historic Biblical Christ. Kaler's point was that we have no sources capable of sustaining a biography of Jesus. The Gospels are inadequate as sources for a complete life of Jesus. Consequently, biographers of Jesus can achieve their goal only by drawing upon what Kaler called a fifth gospel, meaning the historian's own ideals. They fill up the gaps in the gospel record read as history by reading into the accounts elements of their own faith and priorities. Hence, the so-called historical Jesus. The many and varied Jesuses of the 19th century quest were the result of the many and varied ideals and principles drawn upon to fill out the scant and uncertain historical data of the Gospels themselves, hardly deserving the title historical in the proper sense. In complete contrast, argued Kaler, what we have in the Gospels is the historic biblical Christ. The two words translated historical and historic, historisch and geschichtlich, make his point. History, he understands as merely historical, the bare data, independent of any significance which might be placed on them. Geschichte, on the other hand, denotes history in its significance, historical events and persons which attract attention by reason of the influence they have exercised. The point is that the Gospels present the geschichtliche Christus, Jesus seen in his significance. In contrast, the attempt to uncover a historical Jesus stripped of the significance hitherto attributed to him, and now rather like a bare tailor's dummy, ready to be clothed with the significance modern individuals might claim to see in it. The point is obviously similar to the one argued above, that there is no historical Jesus to be found in the Gospels, only the historic figure evident to us through the influence he exercised on his disciples, through the impact he made on them in calling them into discipleship. The difference is that Kaler thought in terms of the biblical Christ, the Christ who was preached by the early Christians. In other words, he was thinking in terms of what later would be understood as post-Easter faith. It was in such terms that Bultmann owned the influence of Kaler. What stood at the center for Bultmann was the kerygma of the gospel, the kerygmatic Christ, the preached Christ. But my reformulation of Kaler's point in terms of the first faith, the pre-Easter faith of the disciples, still recognizes the force of Kaler's argument, without following Bultmann in discounting all faith other than Easter faith. Thus reformulated, Kaler's argument is even more effective. To discount the influence that Jesus actually made, to strip away the impact that Jesus actually made, is to strip away everything and to leave an empty stage, waiting to be filled by some creative amalgam of the historian's own imagination and values. If we are unsatisfied with the Jesus of the synoptic tradition, then we will simply have to lump it. There is no other truly historic Jesus. Only the Jesus whom we can see and hear through the influence he had, through the impact he made on his first disciples, as evidenced by the traditions which they formulated and recalled. Only that Jesus is available to the quester. But, and this is my point, that Jesus is available to the quester. So to conclude, I have thus far made only these 2 points of protest against the mainstream of the quest of historical Jesus. First, it has failed to recognize that the faith-creating impact which Jesus made on those he called into discipleship is the appropriate and indeed most obvious and necessary starting point for any attempt to get back to Jesus. It has failed to recognize that the Jesus tradition is the direct effect of that impact, expressive of its force and character, and clear testimony of that impact. And second, the quest has been too long captivated by the will-o'-the-wisp of a historical Jesus, an objective, artifactual figure buried in the Gospels, waiting to be exhumed and brandished aloft as different from the Jesus of the Gospels, not fully realizing that the less the reconstructed Jesus owes to the synoptic picture of Jesus, the more it must be expressive of the agendas of the individual questers. These are the only 2 points I want to make here and now. There is more to be said, and my criticisms of the earlier phases of the quest are incomplete, but the fuller critique requires a further 2 lectures. So, come back again.
We have about 15 minutes for questions and answers. So, Jerry, thank you. This is just an excellent lecture. What a good start.
No questions, let's go on.
Hold on. Yes, sir, in the back.
I've often been fascinated with the expressions in Aramaic in the synoptics. Were they put there intentionally as the actual words of Jesus?
Yes, I think you can argue that very strongly. That Kalavakum, he says to the girl, the synagogue, ruler of the synagogue's daughter. Yes, I think that it's remembered as things he said. It's the most obvious explanation for it. Other explanations have been offered, but they're not at all so obvious, so straightforward. So yes, I think is the answer to that question.
So that is getting back to the historical Jesus.
Yes, I think these are words, my understanding would be these are words which were heard and made an impact on those who heard. And they remembered them and recorded them when they put it into a verbal form, memory.
So we have more than the Jesus of faith, and we actually have this evidence of the historic Jesus.
Yes, but it is always coming through the ears and eyes of those who were there. We can never, as it were, get back into the room and be there with Jesus and the disciples and the girl. We're always that one step removed.
Thank you.
Another question. Yes, sir.
These synoptic gospels are eyewitness accounts of what really happened. And the greater the proximity to the actual event, the greater the validity of accuracy. So in contrast to that, we have the historical method people who are not orientated towards Christ. but it's more like a hearsay and far removed from the actual event. So as long as we can prove the authenticity of the synoptic gospels, I think we should go by that rather than more like hearsay evidence of the historians of the 20th century who are far removed from the actual event. So it all hinges on the authenticity of the synoptic gospels.
Yes, I wouldn't put it that way. I think that puts it in too black and white, an oversimplified formulation, because I don't want to deny what is pretty obvious when you compare the synoptic tradition, the first three Gospels, that each evangelist, for example, has got his own trust. I'll be saying a bit more about this, but they make their own interpretation, and they retell the story in their own way and making different points at times. So I've had no problem at all with the understanding of tradition. As I say, I'll be saying a lot about this tomorrow. Tradition being performed in the groups and gatherings of the disciples and being told in different ways for different circumstances. What I'm talking about is the starting point, really, the first faith, the beginnings of. And I see that very much in the Synoptic Gospels, in the Synoptic tradition. Although what we now have, of course, is that stories and sayings and teaching being gathered together and grouped in different ways and so forth.
Right, another question. Yes, sir.
I'm curious, Doctor, especially after studying economics, and I've studied economics myself before. I'm just curious, how did you come to faith in Christ?
How did I come to
briefly.
Christ? Briefly.
That's possible.
Well, how long have we got? I was very much involved in my youth with Scripture Union. I don't know if that organisation is known to you over here. Which was very much in Scotland, in schools, the groups meeting in schools and running camps and so on. The school I went to had a very active group, and I got involved in that, went to camps and so on. And I made a commitment about 10, I guess it was. I mean, I tell the story of my life, but is that clear at the moment? Yeah.
Thank you.
Yes.
You mentioned the Sermon on the Mount for showing pre-Easter faith
Yeah.
of the disciples. What other groups of source like Jesus material would you say gives evidence to pre-Easter disciple faith?
Mm-hmm. Well, some of the other stuff is more hard to demonstrate, but I would say, for example, the early forms of the commissioning to the 12 disciples, sending them out in mission. Now that looks as though it's been much used and reworked and used again and again, and of course it's used as mission commissioning in the churches and the Gentile mission and so on. So it's been reshaped quite a lot. But again, the origin, I would say, is pretty obviously pre-Easter. You could say what's called the apocalyptic discourse in Mark 13, again, worked over quite a lot. But again, the origins of it go back to Jesus. If you want, you could put it in non-theological terms, forebodings about the future, what's going to happen to the temple, and so on. Or again, Mark has a collection of parables. These have been collected, of course. He didn't stand up and probably say them one after another. But the forms of them that they come in are often show no indication of any Good Friday or Easter influence. So I take you through quite a heap of material on that point.
Other question? Yes, Adam.
Professor Dunn, you talked about really the difference between pre-Easter faith and you kind of alluded to pre-Easter, post-Easter faith. Really, I'm curious, in your opinion, what exactly changed there?
What you mean Easter?
Yeah.
Oh, another lecture? How long we got here? Wow, life story and now Resurrection. Oh, the resurrection. Is that an answer?
Would your opinion be in any way different from predecessors?
Would what?
Because you had talked about how the faith of the disciples pre-Easter really was carried over by the Christians post-Easter.
Well, no, what I said, not quite that. What I said is the tradition that we have in the Gospels was given, evidently was given a lot of it was given its enduring shape in the pre-Easter mission. And that tradition was carried over as it stood and incorporated in the deeper, more perceptive, richer faith of Easter. So, of course, as I said, the Gospels are themselves clearly set out as Gospels, leading up. They're all leading up to it. This is a characteristic of Gospel. That's why they're called Gospels. It's a story of Jesus climaxing in death and resurrection. But I'm just qualifying that to say that don't think this faith started from cross and resurrection.
William. To what extent did the Easter, the resurrection of Jesus, impact the way that the other traditions, pre-Easter traditions, as you referred to, affect them and how they're conveyed? Surely everything in the New Testament is post-Easter.
Mm-hmm.
But how did that impact any of that earlier material that you were talking about?
Well, part of my point is to say you cannot see any evident impact on it in the detail of it. You can at some points. In John's Gospel, for example, remember the cleansing of the temple, and he talks about destroy the temple and so on, and John adds the explanation. He's talking about his body. It wasn't the temple he was talking about being destroyed and rising again, it was his body. So the earlier tradition is given fresh illumination, fresh understanding, a fresh context, and a richer faith. But my whole point is that so much of it, in its form, has not been affected. Its context, yes, but the actual form is evident of the pre-Easter faith, the impact of Christ.
Yes, Jonathan.
Professor Dunn, let me take that one step perhaps further along. You've talked about how the pre-Easter forms and stories have been changed. In the lecture, you distinguished between the disciples prior to Easter having a disciples' faith but not yet Christian faith, or language to that effect.
Yeah.
Could you talk about the difference between those two, or the contrast between the pre-Easter faith that was disciples' faith and the post-Easter faith that is Christian faith?
Yes. Well, the point I'm really making is that, and it's the same point I was making when I was talking about gospel, that Christian faith is faith in Jesus as crucified and risen. It's Christian faith is not simply that Jesus was a great teacher, healer, wise man, and all that kind of thing. It is the gospel. It is gospel faith, if you like. And all I'm saying is that, well, just to repeat my point, if you say that the only faith evident in the gospel material is Easter, is Christian faith, then you're confessing the inability to get into that earlier situation before cross and resurrection. Whereas I think the character of the material, again and again, is evidently to be explained as the impact made by Jesus already during his mission. It's sort of what I call disciple faith. And that endures. It's not that it's then all transformed and they add in and say, gosh, we can't say that it all depends on how you respond to Jesus' teaching. It depends how you respond to the cross and the resurrection. So we'll score that parable, you know, the wise man, the foolish man, it's no longer gospel. Throw it out. They don't do that.
Yes, ma'am.
Would putting the emphasis more or highlighting more the pre-Easter faith help us to sense more that Christianity is ministry of the underprivileged, whether it's underprivileged economically or spiritually, whereas to purely concentrate on the after Easter faith, we're concentrating sometimes inadvertently on Jesus rather than who he wants us to minister to.
That's a nice point, worth reflecting on. The danger, if I may rephrase your point, the danger is if we're talking only Christian faith, gospel faith, it's all in very spiritual terms of sins forgiven and hope of resurrection, that kind of thing. Whereas when you look at Jesus and try to feel again the impact of Jesus before Good Friday and Easter, then you cannot help but be confronted with somebody who comes to bring good news to the poor and all that, and eats with tax collectors and sinners, etc. Yes, I think part of the spin-off of what I'm saying could well be to say, look guys, even though this tradition is now set within a gospel context, that means also that the gospel includes the whole thing, the pre-Easter preaching, Jesus preaching to the poor and so on. Yeah, I'll go with that.
Yes, go ahead.
Thank you very much for a very stimulating lecture. I enjoyed it very much. I want to play the devil's advocate for just a moment.
Okay.
I can hear Dr. Funk coming back and saying to you, really all you are doing is filling in your fifth gospel. How would you respond to him?
Because, well, I would... this is a chess match. I'm just, what if I say, how's he going to come back at me? I think I just repeat the point that the gospel material, as we have it in the synoptics, is itself evidence of the impact made by Jesus. Now, you have to come back on Wednesday because I'll be developing the point what we can say about Jesus more along these lines. Whereas the point I'm making in critique of Funk and the seminar is that they're pulling all this stuff off that in what I would say an arbitrary way. Whereas I want to say, no, look, where there's no, apart from evidence of Easter and Good Friday faith, then there's no reason why we shouldn't say this is the impact that he made. I'll be saying, when am I saying this? Yeah, on the third session, I'll be saying, why, for example, should we object to the idea that Jesus had preaching an apocalyptic character? Just because we don't like apocalyptic, hey, that's not a reason to throw that out. Now, I think the Jesus seminar has a great thing against apocalyptic. They just don't like a Jesus who's a kind of crazy guy who thinks the world's going to end tomorrow kind of thing. And so, he can't be like that. So rip all that stuff out. I mean, that's a very crude response. But we need to bat it back and forward a bit.
Yeah. Okay, thank you.
Well, thank you for your questions. We're going to break now for our reception, but let's end this session right now with a round of applause. Thank you.